Experts estimate that only 3 to 5 metric tons of pure fentanyl is needed to satisfy the entire U.S. consumption for a year, compared with 47 metric tons of heroin and 145 metric tons of cocaine.
The fentanyl crisis has been building year in and year out. And of course, we mourn the loss of individuals who've lost their lives. Do you know that in 2020, there was an approximately 50% increase in opioid deaths in this country over 2019? 2020 over 2019. The number of opioid overdose deaths in this country has grown each year, year in and year out, well prior to this administration. And what we have to do as a country is address the fundamental underlying cause, which is demand.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Nick Miroff. I cover immigration in the Department of Homeland Security for the Post. Today I'm joined by Alejandro Mayorkas. He's the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and we're going to be discussing the southern border, immigration, and the fentanyl crisis. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. I wanted to ask you, this fentanyl crisis that we wrote about in our series, Cartel RX, spans multiple administrations. But during the pandemic, this problem became significantly worse. We've seen fatal overdose deaths increase 94% since 2019. What's your assessment of the current state of fentanyl smuggling into the United States?
Nick, I think your reporting really spoke very powerfully about three different elements of the challenge and the solution. One is, of course, the human tragedy that fentanyl delivers. We see so many tragic deaths, including of the very young. Two, I think we saw in your reporting, and we, of course, in the Department of Homeland Security and across law enforcement, see, unfortunately, the cruelty of the individuals, the cartels who trafficked in this death-producing substance. And three is the extraordinary dedication, tireless dedication and heroism of law enforcement that battles the cartels, that battles the dealers and traffickers, and tries to rescue and prevent victims from becoming another tragedy. The problem has only increased year in and year out since I think about 2013, 2014. And with that, the intensity of our response has increased as well. We in the Department of Homeland Security have deployed special agents of Homeland Security investigations, our frontline officers and agents of Customs and Border Protection, not only domestically, not only at our border, but internationally for a defense in-depth strategy to battle the scourge of fentanyl.
Mr. Secretary, as you know well, the Department of Homeland Security was created in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks that killed 3,000 Americans. That is the same number of Americans who are dying every 2 weeks now from fentanyl. But I think a lot of people don't sense the outrage or a sense of urgency from the government. What do you have to say to that?
I would say that we have been acting with tremendous urgency, certainly since I took office. We have seized over 1.6 million pounds of precursor chemicals, the chemicals that are used to manufacture fentanyl. The seizures of actually the fentanyl that has been produced has increased exponentially during the last 2 years. We have an across the board, full press, doubling down effort on this very dangerous drug. I hope people realize how very dangerous it is. Nick, at the very outset of our discussion, some of the statistics were displayed on the screen. It's killing people young and old.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the supply issue. You have in the past talked about this as being a demand-driven problem, but I wanted to ask you, given the incredible abundance of these seizures, both in terms of precursor chemicals and fentanyl pills and powder being seized at the border, and the cheap price that we're hearing about, fentanyl pills being sold on U.S. streets for as little as $4. Is it possible for an abundance of supply to drive demand, to create demand?
Well, regrettably, Nick, we've seen a demand for illegal drugs in this country for decades. And when we have a challenge such as the pandemic, which causes so many mental health issues, depression and the like, unfortunately, we see people turn to controlled substances, to illegal drugs as what they think is a balm, but is only an aggravating force in their lives. You couple that with what you've correctly identified as the cheap cost of fentanyl, as well as the strength of its poison, its toxicity, and we have the tragic results that we have seen in this country with over 107,000 overdose deaths last year, and more than 60% of those attributable to fentanyl. But what we are doing here in the Department of Homeland Security with our federal, state, and local tribal territorial partners is also attacking the supply. It is not just a demand issue. It is not just a supply issue. It is all of the above. And we are attacking the supply not only in the interior of the United States, not only at our border, but in the countries of origin. In Mexico, working increasingly with law enforcement in Mexico, by land, by sea, by air. We're attacking it with all our forces, all our tremendous capabilities, thanks to the incredible personnel that we have.
Mr. Secretary, we got a lot of questions from our audience, and I want to go to one right now. Jules Schwartz in Ohio wants to know if there are plans for U.S. government-sponsored free distribution of naloxone. And of course, that's the opioid reversal drug that can save lives if administered in time.
So the treatment element of it is outside the mission of the Department of Homeland Security. That is something for the director of our National Drug Control Policy. I know that there are discussions going on now about the treatment that can be provided, that can be made available. I've read reports about schools actually making Narcan available for emergency treatment because regrettably, not only is fentanyl sold directly to individuals, but it's also used in concealed ways to lace other drugs to disguise the gravity of the poison that fentanyl presents.
One of the things that we have other questions about harm reduction, and late last year, Governor Newsom of California, your home state, he vetoed legislation that would have allowed some California cities to have open supervised drug injection sites as part of a pilot program that was meant to stem this incredible surge of fatal overdoses. So I wanted to ask if this can't pass, if this kind of policy can't pass in one of the country's most progressive states, do you think it's a pipe dream to see comprehensive harm reduction policies with widespread support across the country?
I don't, Nick. I think it's very important to keep at the harm reduction effort to deal with the treatment side of the equation, but we here in the Department of Homeland Security address the law enforcement element of it. Our job is to stop the fentanyl from coming into this United States, stop it on the streets, make sure that it doesn't reach people. That's what we're very focused on with all our might. all our resources, not just our personnel, but we're increasingly using innovative technology and new processes to make sure that we interdict fentanyl at its source.
We spent a lot of time in reporting this series with federal and state drug agents who talked about how overwhelmed they are. They've seen so much suffering, so many deaths, even though they're working, as you say, very hard to try to face down this crisis. Some law enforcement officials working at the border we spoke with estimated that they are only catching about 5 to 10% of the drugs that are coming into the country. Let's take a look at a video from our series that lays out some of these challenges.
So we think that the cartels now, they're getting their chemicals from Asia or other places, then they're building it or making it in labs in Mexico.
When everything is a chemical that can be brought from 5 different countries, and then you can make it in 2 hours in a hotel room in Tijuana, it's mobile. This is really where the bigger challenges are to law enforcement.
Les funcionaba como bodega y es donde almacenaban droga y vehículos. En las piñatas, una de las tantas formas que utilizaban para mover el producto, mover las drogas de aquí y para enviarlas a Estados Unidos. Meter 10,000 o 20,000 pastillas en un vehículo, para ellos es relativamente sencillo en compartimientos.
It's $1,000 an ounce for powder of fentanyl, so they don't have to smuggle as much of it to make a profit. How do you find 5 ounces on a person, or even if they're in a car driving, right, without a canine alert? It's frustrating for all of law enforcement.
Mr. Secretary, I was looking at the most recent CBP figures on fentanyl seizures, and they showed, as you know, a 53% increase month over month. And that was amounted to 3,000 pounds of fentanyl at the border in November alone. And that's the highest total ever, and that's more than CBP was detecting in the course of an entire year just a few years ago. So I want to ask, what needs to happen in order for CBP to be able to detect more fentanyl and more of these hard narcotics at the ports of entry, where also, as you know, the vast majority of these drugs are coming into the country?
Nick, let me answer your question directly, and then let me draw a step back, if I may. First of all, we are doing that which needs to be done. The video very powerfully captured the challenges that law enforcement faces. The fentanyl is brought in very difficult ways to detect, but how are we combating that? We have border enforcement security task forces at mail facilities to interdict the receipt of fentanyl precursors. We use what we call non-intrusive inspection technology that can see through material to identify where fentanyl is concealed, whether it's in particular packaging, whether it's in a passenger vehicle, whether it's in a commercial vehicle. The creativity and ingenuity of the bad guys is extraordinary, but our law enforcement capabilities are more so. And so we are using people, technology, processes to interdict the chemical substances as well as the finished product in the mail facilities, at the border, concealed in trucks, and also at sea and by air, interdicting drones and the like. Let me take a step back as well, because I was a federal prosecutor for 12 years from 1989 to 2001. And I remember working with law enforcement on the front lines at that time, interdicting an increasing amount of cocaine and in various forms, in powder, in crack substances being peddled on the streets. And at times, it felt like a very daunting challenge, in the increasing use, the increasing number of casualties from then that very dangerous substance. We did not tire, we did not slow down in our efforts. We found new ways to battle the spread of what was then a very dangerous controlled substance. It remains so, but it pales in comparison to fentanyl. That's exactly the tenacity and tireless dedication that we're employing to the challenge before us today.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the non-intrusive inspection technology element. One of the missteps or shortcomings that we identified in the course of our reporting this series was this delay in the implementation of NII, or non-intrusive, these scanning systems at the ports of entry. There was a big appropriation for these systems back in 2019. And it's really only in the past year that we've started to see many of these systems come online. We know that the civil works costs for adding this technology came up short and slowed that implementation. So I want to ask you, what is the department and CBP? What are you doing to make sure that these systems are rolled out as quickly as possible, and that the technology is ready to be put in place and to interdict more fentanyl?
So, Nick, just for everyone's benefit, non-intrusive inspection technology is really a remarkable innovation. When a truck, for example, comes through a port of entry at our border, and people should understand, it is not in between the ports of entry that the majority of fentanyl is sought to be smuggled. It's not through the migrants that we encounter in between the ports of entry. It's through passenger vehicles, through commercial trucks at our ports of entry, where the substance is concealed in compartments. And this non-intrusive inspection technology, when a truck runs through it, when drives very slowly through it, we can actually see anomalies. We can see unusual packages or materials in between, hidden inside a tractor trailer, a truck's trailer, and detect an anomaly, and then search the truck, and lo and behold, discover fentanyl and take immediate law enforcement action. We have accelerated our deployment of this technology, and in fact, later this month, Nick, we are we're issuing a funding opportunity to really leverage artificial intelligence to couple with that technology to maximize our impact, our law enforcement detection, interdiction, and prosecution impact.
But if this technology is so effective, why hasn't more of it come to the southern border faster?
Well, I can't speak to the past. All I can speak to is, Nick, that we are accelerating our deployment of that technology as rapidly as possible.
You rightly point out that the vast majority of the fentanyl coming into the country is entering through these ports of entry, or it's being seized at highway checkpoints. That is, it's coming in vehicles, in passenger vehicles, and commercial trucks. It is not coming through the desert. Migrants are not carrying fentanyl by and large. But I do want to ask you, does the extraordinary wave of migration that we are seeing across the southern border, record numbers of apprehensions that CBP is reporting every month, does it have an impact on the agency's ability to detect and stop illegal drugs from entering the country?
No, it doesn't, Nick. I mean, we have a workforce that stays true to the mission, that is tireless. We have surged personnel to the border, not only in between the ports of entry, but at the ports of entry, where we're deploying an increasing amount of technology. We have our field officers at the ports of entry. We have our Border Patrol agents in between the ports of entry. The number of encounters does not take our eye off the ball of battling the scourge of fentanyl.
I wanted to ask about interagency cooperation. As you know, Homeland Security investigations, which is part of DHS, gets its Title 21 narcotics investigation authority from the DEA and the Department of Justice. Do you think that HSI should have its own independent Title 21 authority? And is that something you've been speaking to lawmakers about?
Nick, we work very closely with our partners at the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. We do depend on their delegation of that Title 21 authority. Title 21 is the provision of the United States Code, the federal law that allows for the investigation and prosecution of drug offenses. We do require a delegation at this point. I do strongly believe that Homeland Security investigations should have that authority itself, and we are hopeful that legislation will pass to give it to us. It'll be a force multiplier in our effort to combat fentanyl and other controlled substances that are causing so much damage in our country and beyond. Homeland Security Investigations is the primary criminal investigative agency within the Department of Homeland Security and has grown in preeminence over the years.
Mr. Secretary, fentanyl production has really shifted from China to Mexico. The president is going to be in Mexico early next week. How would you assess the Mexican government's cooperation in helping stop fentanyl trafficking and prevent fentanyl from entering the United States?
Nick, so we continue to see precursor chemicals originate from China. We also see equipment used in the manufacture of fentanyl originate from China, and therefore our interdiction capabilities are driven accordingly. So we are seeking to interdict the flow of the precursor chemicals and the equipment from China. But we're seeing it come to Mexico increasingly, and the cartels are peddling this poison to our children and to our friends and neighbors here in the United States. We're working increasingly with the government of Mexico. I've met multiple times with Attorney General Gertz of Mexico, both here in the United States and in Mexico, and our law enforcement cooperation is only growing. We have transnational criminal investigative units, the TCIUs, deployed in Mexico to work with our Mexican counterparts to interdict the chemicals, the equipment, the finished product, the money, the proceeds of illegal sales. We're really battling all elements of the chain of criminality and the criminals, not just in interdicting the drugs themselves, but interdicting the flow of funds from its sale and the instrumentalities that they use.
And if I could ask you to just quickly grade that cooperation, what kind of grade would you give it? Where does it stand?
Nick, we are working incredibly closely with our partners, and that partnership is only strengthening as we speak.
Mr. Secretary, what more does Congress need to do to help address this crisis? Where else can the department get help?
Nick, we're really grateful for the support we've received from Congress. I think you referenced earlier the fact that Congress funded us as a department to purchase 135 new non-intrusive inspection capability. The technology, we're grateful for that. We need additional personnel to man that equipment. So what we're hoping for is additional funding for technology, for personnel, both here in the U.S. and to deploy internationally to reach the problem at its source. That's what really we're hoping for, and we're continuing to press for it, and we really appreciate the support we've received thus far.
We've been watching the House proceedings this morning, as maybe you have as well. What do you think are the prospects of comprehensive immigration reform coming out of this Congress?
Nick, I'm an undying optimist. On his very first day in office, President Biden sent to the Hill, to Congress, a comprehensive package that would have meant so much to our ability to really manage the situation at the border, to really bring a broken immigration system that hasn't been reformed for decades, to really bring it into the present day, not just from a point of view of enforcement, but also realizing the opportunities that immigration brings to our country. The labor need in this country is so great. We have 10 million job openings in the United States. I was reading about what Canada is doing to address 1 million open jobs. They're bringing in about 1.3 million migrants to fill that labor need that cannot be met within their own borders. President Biden sent forward a comprehensive package on day one. It has not occurred yet. We haven't realized the reform that everyone understands is so desperately needed. I'm an undying optimist, and we're going to stay true to the fight to pass reform that our country needs and from which our country will prosper.
Mr. Secretary, I want to ask, the Supreme Court has blocked the administration's attempt to end the pandemic border restrictions, the Title 42 border restrictions. They're going to be in place for at least a few more months, as we know. But I do want to ask, can this administration handle the potential surge of migration along the border when Title 42 comes to an end, given that we see CBP already struggling to manage the current volume of people crossing?
Nick, there's no question that the number of encounters that we are experiencing at the border is straining our system. And this harkens back to the question you previously posed, which is we're operating within a system that is fundamentally broken. No one disagrees with that. We just can't seem to agree upon the solution, and a solution is long, long overdue. Within the broken immigration system that we are operating, we are managing the number of encounters, and we are prepared to address the end of Title 42. We've been preparing for this since well beyond last year.
I want to ask you about an anniversary coming up, and that is the 2-year anniversary of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. In your assessment, what threat does domestic violent extremism pose to the United States at this point? And what efforts is the department and the administration making to combat it?
Nick, both the director of the FBI, Chris Wray, and I have spoken about this, as well as the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christine Abizaid. Domestic violent extremism is one of the greatest terrorism-related threats that we face on the homeland. Just on New Year's Day, we saw law enforcement officers attacked by an individual radicalized by a foreign terrorist ideology. That is not domestic violent extremism. We classify that as homegrown violent extremism. And I mention that just to make the point that the threats of yesterday remain the threats of today, but regrettably, new threats have emerged. And one of the greatest threats that we face in the terrorism realm on the homeland is the threat of domestic violent extremism. And we are doing a tremendous amount as a Department of Homeland Security under the leadership of President Biden in an all of the federal government effort, working with our state, local, tribal, territorial partners, and also the private sector. This really requires an all of society effort. We have a grant program, a terrorism prevention and targeted violence, a grant program where we are equipping and empowering local communities to address the threat within their own neighborhoods. We identified and created a domestic terrorism branch within our Office of Intelligence and Analysis to bring greater focus to this. I identified domestic violent extremism as a national priority area in our greater grant programs. We have a newly formed Center Prevention Programs and Partnership that is developing new models with local communities to identify individuals who may be descending into violence by reason of an ideology of hate, a false narrative, a personal grievance, to develop new prevention models. We're doing so much as a department with our partners across the federal government and in communities across this country.
Mr. Secretary, many challenges on your plate. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you for joining us here on Washington Post Live today.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I'm incredibly grateful for the attention you bring to the issues that we are addressing, and I'm incredibly grateful to the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security who keep the American public safe.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today on Washington Post Live. To check out what interviews are coming up, please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find out more information about all of our upcoming programs. I'm Nick Miroff. Thanks again for joining us.